So we have a lovely, lovely guest today, and I'm really excited. I'm going to tell a little story about the first time I saw this man. I mean, obviously I'd heard of him because he wrote, I don't know, just this little film called Sleepless in Seattle, this tiny little movie. And so he wrote this movie, and then he would come to conferences. And remember, I tell the story about coming to a conference and them talking about getting your screenplay past a reader. As a writer, I won the contest they had that was part of that conference. And then that got me a ticket to come. And then during the conference, they were talking about getting your script past a reader. And I was like, a reader? What the heck's a reader? And so they told me what it was. I'm like, I'm in. The next day I was walking around going, hi, I'm a reader, even though I didn't know what to do. And then that got the whole ball rolling. Well, our guest today he would come and give panels. He said people didn't want to listen to what I had to say, but they'll listen to what I write. And I absolutely love that. And what that struck in me as a reader is that it's our job to get people's stories out so that people can hear their voice and hear their message. And I'm going to introduce our lovely, spectacular guest who has a book coming out. We're going to talk about that too. So excited. So let me bring on Mr. Jeff Arch.
Hi.
So tell us, welcome. How are you? Thank you so much for doing this.
Doing great. I hope everybody's safe and sane. You know, we're writers, so as sane as you can be. And I do remember meeting Carolyn at the store, at the Selling to Hollywood. It seems like 30 lifetimes ago. But, you know, that was the first thing I was ever asked to do. I didn't even know I was going to do any public speaking at all. And that conference is where I've now spoken all over the world. That's how it started. I've had like a whole speaking career because of that.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's so, because you're such a natural and just like so authentic. And so it really, you know, it just made it so that you could really relate to you and, you know, the story that you told as a writer. So it's super cool. Thank you for joining us. So we polled everybody and we got some questions ahead of time. And this is always the first question that everybody asks. I'm sure you've been asked it a bajillion times, which is your origin story, basically like how you got started as a writer. And then what was the spark for Sleepless in Seattle, and what did, you know, tell us the story of how that came to be, basically.
The thing I told you that you just, you know, shared with them, the thing about nobody listened to what I said, but everybody would stop and read what I wrote. That was from childhood. I was the youngest of 3 boys and the youngest of 7 cousins, and everything rolled downhill to me. And parents, any of you who are parents, who are, you know, by the time you have the 3rd kid, you're about as disengaged as you can be, and so you leave that kid to be raised by the other kids. And you know, one way to be heard is to shout, and I wasn't that kind. Another way I noticed, if I wrote something down, you know, we used to have to write notes on them and leave them on the refrigerator if we had to go somewhere. And so there'd be these little pads of paper, and I'd fill up the whole pad. I'd fill up the entire refrigerator. By the time I was finished with the note where I was going, it was time to come back. But I just remember having this experience of, I think my mom or somebody showed something that I had written, I don't know, a week before that, and they laughed about it. And I went, you know, I can get paid basically today for something I did a week ago. And that was my first experience getting royalty, you know, not in terms of money, but just like affirmation, like, whoa, you know. So if you're telling jokes, you got to be always telling jokes. No one's going to say, what about that joke that bombed? But if you write it, it stays with people. So I saw as an early path through how to make it through the world was that somehow I can communicate with the written world when plain English coming out of my mouth does nothing. So I used that. I went with that. And I remember in elementary school, some book that we read, teacher said it took the author 11 years to write a book. And I thought, that's it for, I'm not doing that. You know, that's it for books. You know, people wrote things for a living, or the people did were just somebody else. You know, either they were dead writers, and you know, you thought they're all on statues somewhere, and that current living writers, people whose names are on the books that are on the, you know, they're inaccessible. And none of them came from my hometown. So writers are always authors were always somebody that came from somewhere else. So
I
therefore, I was.
want to throw in there really quick because we talk about this all the time because we have a lot of people in here that don't live in New York, LA, or even big cities, and we talk about it all the time that there's this mindset that it's other people that do this, and I'm like, all those other people are just people, and you're just totally demonstrating that. So thank you.
Two of the most famous writers ever were a bunch of working class kids in Liverpool, England. And that's Lennon and McCartney. And what if they said, oh, all the musicians come from somewhere else? So when I got that, there's no island where we all come from. And I went to college at Emerson in Boston because I wanted to learn how to make movies. So by the time my love went to movies, I started out reading books, of course, but my love went to movies. I just couldn't. All my heroes, all my teachers were movie heroes. So I learned how to behave in tense situations by what did my favorite movie hero do in that situation? Because heroes leave examples, but I still didn't know that people actually wrote movies. The idea of a screenwriter didn't. So I learned how to make them, and I got into shooting movies, and then I got into lighting movies, and then I got into lighting concerts and rock and roll bands and reggae. I moved to LA, and I wanted to make Hollywood movies. I had a friend who was a casting agent at William Morris, and I would just go visit him for lunch and just walk out with 5 screenplays, just 5 at a time until I had a room full. And I would get the screenplays of movies that I had already been made that I liked, so I could see how they did what they did. And I didn't know the names for anything. I just knew, I gave myself this kind of suggestion that I'm just going to absorb everything that works, and I'm going to delete everything that doesn't work without knowing why. I'm going to read the masters, and I'm going to absorb what they're doing right until it's internal. And at the same time, it's what a lot of people don't do. I had been reading Variety since I was 21, Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, every day that I could. And I learned how the business works that way. I would notice the first seed that would go into a ground, oh, this person made a movie deal, and oh, I'd heard of that producer, and then over the months you'd watch, oh, now they're casting, and whoa, now they're and I'd watch how the corporate, the agencies and how everybody's advancing, and there's certain names that by the time I met them, they were rock stars to me, but these are people that work in studios who they're not rock stars to anybody. But I just thought, I've been reading your name for 10 years, and now we're in the same room. Anyway, I didn't think you could write movies until the decision to actually write them came. I had a mentor named Conrad Hall, a cameraman, because that's what I wanted to be. And I did a bold thing when I was 20 or 21. I was in Boston, and he was in LA. And I thought, I'm going to call this guy. I'm going to see if his number's in the phone book. Back then, that's what you did. You called information and saw if somebody's number was there. That's the only way of finding. And I figured if his number's in the phone book, I'm going to consider that meeting me halfway. And so his number was in the book, and I left a message, and he called me back. And he said, the typical LA thing, if you're ever around, you're coming to have lunch. So 2 months later, I flew to California and showed up, and we had lunch, and it started a friend. So I went from production to writing because Conrad Hall told me, you're really good at this. You're a good cameraman. You can be a director of photography. You can be me one day. But if you know this, it's going to take you 15 years because of the unions. And he said, I know already you're not going to be able to wait 15 years. And he said, if you can write, you should write, because now this is the beginning of the era of the writer. The studio system was gone, and people were coming out of nowhere with spec scripts. And the base that I knew at the time was this wonderful movie called Breaking Away that was written by a guy named Steve Tesich, who was a first-generation immigrant. He was from Hungary, I think. And he got to America, and he loved this country so much. He just loved this country. Beautiful movie. I hardly ever watched Johnny Carson at this, but I'm watching Johnny Carson and Steve Tesich is on, and I'm going, I've never seen the writer. You know, it's always the director. It's always the actor. What did this guy do that he's the writer? He's on Johnny Carson, and he's talking about his experience of making Breaking Away, that the director, Peter Yates, would listen to him and had him on the set. And so basically this guy's on Johnny Carson describing my dream. You can get a movie made by Hollywood that is your personal kind of thing that comes out of nowhere. The director will have you on the set. I didn't have any dreams of directing. I had dreams of a director who wanted to work with me as a writer. But if you want to get their attention, you have to make it beautiful. You know, your version of beautiful. The writing has to be, or the storytelling. If you're going to do something different, you have to do it really, really, really well. And that paid off many years later when I got an idea for a love story where the people don't meet, because that isn't done. And I was told over and over and over again, no one's gonna buy it. Number one, who the hell is gonna buy a love story where the people don't meet? Romantic leads want to be in movies together and have scenes together. You know, that 60 pages of bickering that they're always doing in the middle of a love story. They want to have that chemistry and fireworks. So nice try, good idea, but no. And they said it'll never get made. And here's where I'm not a rebel. I didn't do it just because they said it would never get made. I did it because the idea was so strong that I knew if I got it right, it would work. I knew if I got this thing right that it was going to be a monster. And, you know, nobody else saw that. The way that idea came and where I was in life and everything, I knew this is it. I'm being given something here that if I don't do it right, I may not get something again. And the interesting thing is, from that conversation where Conrad Hall told me I wasn't going to want to wait 15 years, I should write, it was 17 years before I sold Sleepless. So I would have been a cameraman even quicker if I'd stayed with it. I'm glad I did what I did. But here's the thing. You can ask 1,000 writers what their path was, and you'll get 1,000 different answers. And none of them really are going to be that useful to you, because they all did it a different way. But they all did it one way, and that was somehow.